Josh, it's great to meet you. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast.
Thanks for the invitation.
Canada, eh?
I know. Tell me about it.
It never ends, and it just seems to be getting worse. The latest, of course, is that Nova Scotia, followed by New Brunswick, has banned summer. I'm joking, only kind of, but they've banned Canadians, well, anyone really, I suppose, except for private landowners, from accessing the woods. So accessing crown lands, public lands for hiking, ATV use, etc. What's the justification for this ban? Let's start with that.
Well, summer is pretty much over in Nova Scotia for a lot of people if they like to, go camping or fishing or hike, or if they own private property and they want to have family over and just, hang out in the woods. Summer really is over because they've put in place this ban on using the woods without a permit until October 15th, suggesting that they plan to keep this in place for a long time. New Brunswick also has a similar ban. What they say the justification is that it's really dry in the province, that the forest fire risk is much greater than it usually is. If you look at, Environment Canada's maps, it shows high to extreme forest fire risk in Nova Scotia, which is frankly pretty normal in most of the country most of the time, but Nova Scotia isn't as used to wildfires as the rest of Canada, so they've come up with this extreme overreaction, which is banning people from going to the woods for any reason unless they have a permit.
I mean, I'm from BC, and in BC we always have bans on campfires in the hottest part of the summer months, which is annoying if you're camping, for example, and want to cook, but I mean, has something gotten worse that's led to this ban this year? I've not heard of something like this happening in the past. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, so these things have happened in the past in Nova Scotia, but not to the same degree. So the first thing is this is province wide. It's in BC, for example, there's occasionally been backcountry bans when there are actually forest fires happening, which makes sense. And like you say, there's been campfire bans are completely normal in Canada. They suck. Like everybody hates campfire bans, but people accept it because campfires cause forest fires. In terms of what's new in Nova Scotia, I think what's new mainly is that government's got away with a lot of authoritarian measures during COVID and people just accepted them. So now they're saying, well, we could reduce the risk with fire bans, but we could reduce it even more if we don't let anyone go anywhere near the fire, even though things like, walking doesn't actually cause fires. I think in their mind, they're just thinking, well, we'll make this real easy for ourselves, save a lot of money in case there were a fire. Maybe we'll save some money. I don't think that'll actually happen because, like I said, walking doesn't cause forest fires. But I think that's what's going through their mind, is that the population will put up with this. And so we're just going to go ahead and make lives easy for ourselves and do this instead of investing in the things that prevent forest fires in the first place, or being prepared to deal with it in the unfortunate event that there is some out of control fire.
Right. I mean, what does cause these wildfires that tend to happen in the summers?
Yeah, so lots of causes. I'm no expert in the causes generally, although the past few days I've been looking into the stats, and the top causes in Nova Scotia seem to be campfires and arson. If you look in places like BC, lightning is a more common cause, but Nova Scotia, for example, in 2020, those were the two top causes identified were arson and campfires. Nova Scotia had big fires in 2023, and those were caused by people, burning things like garbage in their backyard. Like, people starting fires is what causes fires. It's not like some people have been saying that you could, go hiking in the forest, drop a water bottle and have the sun refract through the water bottle and light things on fire. Like, that's not what causes fires. We have stats and we know that they're caused by things like campfires, arson, trying to clear land using fire, which you can also easily ban. ATVs to a lesser extent, like if you talk to firefighters, they'll say ATVs or hot cars are a risk, but they didn't ban ATVs or hot cars. They banned people from going into the woods for any reason, or walking on trails, or in Halifax is now not allowed, right? So it's just the extreme overreach considering the actual causes.
Right. And again, these are public lands. So these are lands that are paid for by taxpayers, by tax dollars. Is this constitutional?
Yeah, so in Nova Scotia, to clarify, it's not just the public lands, it's also private lands that this applies to.
Oh, right, because the
Yeah,
private landowners they can use their own lands, but they
exactly.
aren't allowed to let other people onto
That's
their
right.
land.
They
Okay.
can let other people, well, it's unclear, to be honest, whether they can even let other people onto their land. They certainly can't let people into forested areas of their land at all, without the permit, which is only for, forestry industry or mining, things like that. Is this constitutional? Well, you have a constitutional right under Section 7 of the Charter, which is life, liberty, and security of the person, and not to have that interfered with except in accordance with fundamental justice. And what that means is a lot of things, but it includes the right to movement and the right to roam and walk around freely. There was a case in the 1990s of a man who was on a list because he had committed sexual assault against a minor, and that led to a ban on him being in all kinds of public places. And the Supreme Court said, well, his rights are violated because he can't go to parks or public swimming pools, because there might be children there, was the reason. But the Supreme Court said, no, he's got a right to movement and liberty. So apparently, those people have rights, but the rest of us don't have a right to go in the forest. Like, that doesn't seem right. And the issue is with Section 7 is whether it's arbitrary or not. So if you have a ban and it says ATVs cause fires, and there's a big fire risk right now, we're banning ATVs in the forest temporarily, like that's the type of thing that would not be arbitrary to the courts. But just saying you can't take your kids in a wagon through a trail to day camp for the rest of the summer, or you can't go fishing on your own property with a friend, that type of thing is just, it's obviously arbitrary and violates Section 7. There's other possible constitutional rights implicated, like Aboriginal rights under Section 35, equality rights if people are homeless and they have to be in the woods. And probably the most important thing here is just that it's not a reasonable decision, because the purpose of the act includes preventing forest fires, but it says, the government can designate zones where they can limit travel into those zones. But what they've done is said, oh, the whole province till October 15, is essentially a no-go zone if there are some trees growing there. Like, that's just way overbroad. So I think that's probably the biggest legal issue.
And I've seen online that some Canadians have been defying the ban and facing, pretty crazy fines, from, as far as I can tell, $25,000 up to $125,000.
So the standard fine is 25,000. So if you get a ticket, if you walk into the woods and someone sees you, a police officer or a conservation officer just walking in the woods, your ticket is going to say $25,000 on it. Like, when you get to court, it might be some different number. It might be higher, it might be lower, but that's the going rate. And the premier himself said he wants to see zero tolerance on this. So he wants people to get the $25,000 fine, which, by the way, used to be in the hundreds of dollars. Like, this fine was just raised last year by the province. So that's pretty extreme. And there's one guy on social media who's former veteran. He purposefully got a ticket because he wants to fight this himself. And we at the CCF do not recommend that. I've had people, more than one person, reach out to me saying, I'm going to go get a ticket. And I said, please don't. Like $25,000 is life altering, right, for a lot of people. So don't bother going and doing this, because you probably will get ticketed and you might not be able to afford to pay that ticket. So there will be constitutional challenges. I guarantee you there will be probably more than one. We're looking into one at the CCF right now. And that's the way to sort of challenge this. Like, don't go and risk your liberty or your financial well-being to do this.
I mean, I sort of like the idea of people rebelling and just going into the woods anyway, though I see what you're saying around these kinds of fines. I mean, what would happen if you got a $25,000 fine for going into the woods and you didn't pay?
Yeah, so I mean, you could potentially face contempt of court charges, I believe. It's not entirely clear to me. Like, this may be they'll find a way to enforce it eventually. So it could be the type of thing where they garnish your wages, or where they go and take property from you. You know, they send the sheriff after you and identify particular property, maybe take your car or your boat if you have one. Maybe put a lien on your house. Like, I don't know exactly how this will be enforced, but those are the types of risks that you face when you go against the government. And that's part of the problem here too, is we're not talking just $100 tickets or something that you could go and challenge if you want to make an argument that your rights are violated. It's way more serious than that.
Right. It feels like in Canada, people are being beat down in a lot of ways. Like, it feels as though spiritually and psychologically, Canadians are just, there's less and less freedoms, more and more restrictions. I really like less and less fun, I would say. I mean, recently you wrote about this for the line. Sean, I am not sure if I'm saying his last name right. Sean Feucht? How do you?
I think I've heard it said Feucht. So Sean Feucht is what I've heard.
Okay, so I said it wrong. I mean, governments across Canada canceled at least 6 shows planned in public spaces by this singer, who's an American Christian singer. And I can't really, the reasoning supposedly was that he didn't have permits. Is that legitimate?
Yeah, so it's not. What happened here is, honestly, it's horrifying if you care about freedom of speech or freedom of assembly or even freedom of religion. Governments, they can deny permits for, serious safety reasons. But what they did here in a lot of cases was he had permits, and people complained that they didn't like his speech because, CBC did a story about him where they said he was pro-MAGA, he's anti-abortion, he ran as a Republican candidate, and he's not the type of person that CBC likes or wants to attend a concert at. And this got people with their elbows up saying he should be canceled. And surprisingly, I was surprised, honestly, that all of these municipalities and Parks Canada, one after another, pulled his permits. Or in the case of Montreal, where he tried to do an impromptu concert / prayer session at a church, they said, you need a permit for that, which, you need to apply for like 10 days in advance or something, even though it's an impromptu little gathering, and fined him $2,500 for that, according to news media. So that's obviously just when you attack people based on the content of their message like that, you're violating free speech in a way that is really totally inexcusable. It's not like there was a bomb threat or some serious safety threat. They just did this because they didn't like his speech, and people were calling to cancel
him. And this is sort of ironic to me because we've seen these, pro-Hamas rallies and protests across Canada and Canadian cities, taking over streets, taking over malls, blocking traffic. for months and months and months, I think for almost a year now. And I mean, these rallies could arguably constitute hate speech. There's anti-Jew hate speech that happens at these rallies. I believe in free speech, so I'm not suggesting these people be arrested, but, you know, I wonder if these people have permits.
Yeah, so the thing is, what if you want to do like a spontaneous protest, and most protests are going to be spontaneous, they're going to be last minute sort of get-togethers. I don't think the Constitution can require you to get a permit for that just to use the space in the park or to, you know, march down the street, as long as you keep moving. Once you start blockading, that's, you know, that's no longer constitutionally protected, because the right is the right to peaceful assembly, and peaceful means not seriously interfering with other people's rights, you know, through coercion or saying like, you know, we're going to block the traffic. Like, that's not peaceful protest, and that's not protected. So as much as we might not like the message of those particular protests, they have a right to protest, just like Sean Feucht has a right to sing to people or pray or say things that people find offensive about abortion or LGBT issues or whatever, as long as they don't cross the legal line into, you know, some sort of crime. And in Feucht's case, like, the things he said, none of it actually reaches the legal limit for hate speech. And the same is often true of the pro-Palestinian, anti-Israel people. That they say things that, you know, a lot of us think are, well, that's hateful, or we think that's genocidal, but it's not going to meet the legal definition of hate speech, which is really, really high in Canada. It's the most extreme forms of vilification and detestation that are likely to lead to, you know, certain effects like violence, essentially, against the particular group, and fairly imminent violence too, right? So the law is not always clear on that, but most of the speech that is at these protests is not going to be offside the Constitution, and nothing that Feucht has said before violates the Constitution either. But even if he had said something hateful like that, you can't ban that in advance, right? Like, the answer to that is you go on stage and you arrest him if he commits hate speech. Although, in fact, you need like the Attorney General's permission, so you'd have to do it afterwards. But you can't preemptively say you're canceled because you might do a hate speech in the future, right? Like, Megan, I'm sure
That's funny because I was canceled because I might do a hate speech in the future.
I know. I remember that incident. I don't know what the police said to you. Like, if there's a riot happening, that's a legal limit that's acceptable. Were you causing a riot, Megan? Were you inciting people
No,
to
I was not
physical
causing
violence?
a riot. I was just trying to speak in public about women's rights. But
yeah, that shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't have happened.
I mean, we actually won. You know, I've been accused of hate speech many times in Canada, but the one incident that I was thinking of is we were trying to plan, or we did plan an event at the Cowichan Community Center over on Vancouver Island, and they canceled us because they accused me of, you know, I suppose like a form of thought crime or pre-crime, I suppose. I would probably commit a hate speech, so they had to cancel me, but we fought it with the Democracy Fund, with the help of the Democracy Fund. So
did you win?
Yeah, we did. We won, and we were able to do our event. We went back and forth with them via our lawyers for like about a year. It took quite a long time, and eventually they gave in and let us hold our event. So that was good. The other time, which was funny, was the first ever event that happened in Vancouver discussing this conflict between trans activism, or so-called trans rights, and women's rights, was a talk that I was doing or planning to do at the Vancouver Public Library. And they tried to cancel us via this tactic that's been used a few times on me, and I think on some other people too, where they try to charge you these exorbitant security fees that they know that you can't afford because you're so dangerous, and there's like a danger to the staff, or a danger to the building, or a danger to attendees. And so that's their essential way of canceling you, because it's like, okay, well, I don't have $9,000 to pay for private security. And what ended up happening is that we fought it with our lawyers at the JCCF, and we won, but they made us hold the event. They made us change the date and then hold the event after hours. So we had to have the event at like 9 p.m. But we did it. But prior to the event, the CBC hosted a panel to discuss the event and whether or not I might do a hate speech at the event. But they didn't invite me to participate in the panel. They just sort of, speculated about what I might say, whether I might do a hate speech. And I've been on the CBC before, before I became a bigot. I had written for the CBC and I'd been on the CBC, so they have my contact information. The CBC in Vancouver is also located right across the street from the Vancouver Public Library, and they discussed whether or not I might commit a hate speech, and then declined to actually come to the event to cover the event to see if I would do a hate speech. I didn't do a hate speech as far as I was concerned, but needless to say, I mean, it's the bar for hate speech is very confusing if you look towards outlets like the CBC, I would say.
Well, we should talk about that a bit, because I've said that this limit is really, really high, and it's the most extreme forms of vilification or detestation. That comes from a 2014 case called Lotcott. But I almost feel bad for some of these city officials who are looking at the free speech jurisprudence in Canada, because in that same decision, they say it has to be this extremely high bar. They say offensive speech is not enough to limit speech just because it's offensive or because it ridicules or belittles. The judge says that you can, talk about taking away rights from other groups, or you can criticize those groups and cause emotional harm to them. And all of that is justified. But then he gives all these examples of things that would be considered hate speech. For example, he says, if you say the group is plotting to destroy Western civilization, well, that actually is hate speech that can be limited, even though there might be religious groups that we might want to say in a free society are plotting in that way. Like, I'm not accusing anyone in particular, but should be able to say that in a free country. They also say comparing people to child abusers or pedophiles could potentially be hate speech in some cases, but there's lots of reasons you might want to say that about particular people. So I think what the court is trying to say is, if you say those things and it's motivated by this extreme detestation or vilification, then it can be illegal. And so that's why, as a lawyer, I wouldn't be too worried about losing in court. But for the public, it's really hard to parse those things. Like you're saying, well, offensive speech is protected, but saying a group is plotting to destroy Western civilization is not. Like, what do you make of that, right? So I'm not surprised that a lot of people are confused about where that legal line is.
Yeah, I mean, with regard to the transgender issue, which is, of course, what has been my focus, or like a pretty big focus of my work and my public speaking for, over a decade. What they usually say, and what they said in the case of the Cowichan Community Center, is that because gender identity and gender expression is protected under the Human Rights Code and the Criminal Code, my speech, they predicted, would question the existence of transgender people. I mean, it's all very vague, but that usually, the line of reasoning usually is something along those lines. Like, you're questioning the existence, or you're erasing the existence. You're saying that transgender people don't exist, which somehow constitutes hate speech. That's, what I say around transgender people not existing is not that people who identify as transgender don't exist, or even that they shouldn't exist. It's that the concept itself is incoherent, and there's no such thing as a trans person, because you can't change sex or not have a sex and somehow be in some kind of middle ground, or go from male or female or something like that. It's a pretty rational explanation and argument that I have, but that's sort of usually what they say. But it's interesting that something so vague would be used as an accusation of potential hate speech and, really a potential crime. Like, oh, well, we can't be liable because this is criminal, what you're saying.
Yeah, well, I don't think there's much risk of well, obviously, don't take this as legal advice. I'm a lawyer. I have to say that, like, you're not my client, and if you need legal advice, speak to your own lawyer. But hypothetically, making that type of argument free of the emotions like that lead to vilification and detestation, if it's free of that emotions and it's reason, if you're using reason and logic, there's a 2021 case called Ward in Quebec, which is the case where the comedian was originally ordered to pay $42,000 in fines because he made jokes about a famous disabled boy and his mother. In that case, they say, if the audience can discern that it's not, essentially hatred, that you're not trying to vilify or detest, that you're trying to have a reasoned argument, then that's not going to be the type of thing that you can limit in a country that protects freedom of speech. So, not legal advice for your particular case, but if the audience can discern that, then you're probably pretty safe. When it comes to the human rights code stuff, the human rights code is protecting people when they're getting services, like whether it's you're getting you're trying to rent an apartment, you're trying to order something in a restaurant, you're trying to stay in a hotel, or you're providing a service like a library service. So the library itself is not discriminating against anybody, even if you said something that did meet the legal description for discrimination. So I really don't understand how they always seem to think, well, it doesn't fit our policy about discrimination. Well, you're not the one discriminating. You're just, you are discriminating if you don't allow someone to speak because of their views, but it's not the library discriminating anyway. It's the library's job to provide a space for people to debate ideas and not police those ideas. And they can't fall back on these silly excuses. They're just not correct in my view.
Yeah. We often hear that there's no such thing as free speech in Canada. Is that true?
I think you can make that argument in a way. A lot of people say there's no such thing as free speech, and then they'll point to the charter and say, well, the charter doesn't say free speech. It just says free expression. And the idea of free expression is it's an umbrella category, and it's mostly speech. It's mostly words that people have, but it's just meant to also say that if you're attempting to convey meaning, like with a silent protest of some kind, that also is protected. So, but in terms of the question, like, do we have free speech in that we're truly free to say whatever we want without government sanction or consequences? I think the answer is no. Like we have free speech protected in the charter. There are some good legal decisions out there that you can use to protect yourself. But if we have, codes of conduct and criminal hate speech laws, and if people are not able to use library spaces because they might discriminate in the future, I think you can make a good argument that we don't have much free speech, and that we need to teach people like why we have free speech, and get them involved in getting it back, because free speech is important to everybody, no matter where you are in the political spectrum. At some point, some government is going to want to censor you. Maybe not today, but eventually they will, right?
Yeah, and I don't mean to keep bringing it back to me, but I've had such difficult experiences trying to book any space at all to speak about these issues in Canada. Again, specifically this conflict between gender identity ideology and women's rights, and whether they're private spaces or spaces like community centers. I literally think in almost every case, if not in every case, we've been canceled and have had to hustle to find a new space.
Wow.
Last minute. So yeah, I think we could argue that there's no free speech in Canada. I think what sometimes people are referring to is the difference between free speech laws or hate speech laws in the US and the protections of free speech in the US versus in Canada? What are those differences?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the United States, they're sort of the OGs of free speech. Like when the United States was formed in 1776, they were able to do that to, get rid of England and say, no, we're going to be an independent country, because they had free speech and because they were able to have these debates in newspapers, even though, the king would obviously not want them to be saying we're gonna overthrow the king and start our own country, right? So they recognize the importance of saying controversial things without censorship. And so the First Amendment, when they decided to add rights and write those down into the US Constitution, says that Congress shall make no law abridging free speech. And much like Canada is now, I would say, although maybe even worse, that wasn't really very well respected by their courts, even up till 1920. So in 1920, the Supreme Court heard a bunch of cases about people that had been arrested and charged and put in jail because they opposed the war effort. So these were like socialists who said things like, munitions workers should go on strike, or they said that capitalism is just there to support Wall Street, and we should rise up against capitalism and the war effort, and we shouldn't be going to war with the Soviet Union because with Russia. So in these cases, the Supreme Court there found, oh, well, if the government makes a law and it's to prevent some harm, then that's okay. That's not abridging free speech. But the text of the First Amendment literally says Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. So anyway, there was in dissent in that case, Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes read John Stuart Mill, who's the famous free speech philosopher, and realized that actually, no, wait, the government can't limit ideas. They can limit, for harmful forms of speech or speech that's going to have imminent physical consequences, like inciting violence at an assembly, something like that. But they can't limit the content of ideas. And our Supreme Court actually picked that distinction up, that in a free society, you never limit people's ideas, in a bunch of cases in the 20th century. And then we get the charter, and it says everyone has the right to freedom of expression, and the only limits are those that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And you would hope that the Supreme Court would just follow the US court, or the previous judges in Canada that had essentially said you can never censor ideas. But that's not what they said. They picked up this report that a bunch of professors, including former Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, had put out, saying we need hate speech laws and restrictions on what people can say because people can't be trusted with their own thoughts, and it can lead to bad consequences. Like it could lead to what happened in Germany in the Second World War. So we need free speech laws. What he didn't say, the Supreme Court justice, was, they had hate speech laws in pre-Nazi Germany, and they didn't do much to stop that. So anyway, our court very early on decided that we're not going to have ultimate free speech like they do have in the United States. And since then, it's been this sort of tug of war between people that think you should never be able to censor ideas, which is what I think, and then people that think that, no, it's okay as long as the idea is harmful, the government can just shut it down.
Yeah. So last year in 2024, the Liberal Party's Online Harms Act, Bill C-63, was tabled. Is that what's happening with that bill now? Where has that gone?
Yeah, it's a good question. So C-63 was this whole bill where they wanted to do a bunch of things, including doing the pre-crime thing where they actually have a legal justification to shut down your speech in advance. If they thought you were going to do a hate speech, they'd be able to throw an ankle monitoring bracelet on you, or throw you in jail if you went ahead with it anyway. And they also wanted to bring back the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal, where you could complain about people who said discriminatory speech to you online, and then you'd have to pay a huge fine, and you might have to pay them money too. So this bill was really unpopular. And even though they said, well, this is all about child safety and protecting kids online, and we're going to create this digital safety commissioner to protect kids, even though they tried to sell it that way, they realized it was really unpopular, and they split out parts of the bill, like the pre-crime part, and said, we're not going to do that. Carney has suggested he'll bring some version of it back. They haven't done that yet. I think that the worst aspects of it, they're not going to bother bringing back, because people realize that this is bad for free speech, and that, you know, even for the Liberals, it was going too far and restricting free speech. So wouldn't be surprised to see some version of this come back, but we don't know what's happening yet.
Do you think that we're going to start seeing something along the lines of, you know, what's been referred to as climate change lockdowns? I mean, I think a lot of people have a lot of concerns about their freedoms in Canada right now, freedom of movement, and, you know, potentially these 15-minute cities, and, you know, maybe seeing, I don't know, you need a permit to leave the 15-minute city, or certain people can only drive on certain days, or, you know, for example, if the Liberal Party moves forward with these planned EV mandates, wherein all vehicles manufactured by 2030 are supposed to be EVs, and then, you know, people have concerns about whether or not we have the infrastructure for that, and what that could mean in terms of when you're allowed to charge your EV and drive your EV, all of those kinds of things. What do you see coming down the pike?
I would say, like, a lot of people are saying this Nova Scotia restriction is the climate lockdown. Climate lockdowns are here. I don't think that's right. I don't think the government sees it that way. I think that they're just overreacting to, you know, really dry weather in Nova Scotia, and not thinking about the rights implications of this overbroad travel ban. But I think that the less we push back against this stuff, the more easy it is for the government to just, you know, make laws to control our lives, whether it's for climate change or anything else. I mean, you mentioned not being able to drive your cars on certain days. They already do that in China, right? There's certain cities where you can only go in every second day, depending on your license plate, or get ticketed. In parts of Switzerland, I've heard that AC, air conditioning, is basically banned now for climate reasons, unless you get a special permit showing that you're, like, disabled and need air conditioning. I wouldn't be surprised to see more and more restrictions like that. I mean, people did push back pretty hard on the consumer carbon tax. So I think that the federal government probably knows where people's heads are at. They don't want to spend a lot more money for really negligible differences in climate emissions. So I think we can see versions of this, like small steps toward it. But the more we push back, the less likely it is to happen.
As I mentioned earlier, it feels like a lot of people in Canada are becoming demoralized, you know, in particular ever since COVID and the COVID lockdowns, and concerns about government overreach and encroaching authoritarianism, lack of freedoms in Canada. Do you hear from people that they are thinking of leaving the country?
I mean, yeah, I've heard that so many times. I think you're probably hearing that too. I went to law school several years ago, and a lot of people you meet there are international, right? They're not from Canada. They don't have a lot of ties here. They came to Canada because it seemed like a country that's really prosperous and that has a lot of freedom and opportunities. I think every single one of my friends that doesn't have, you know, family ties to Canada has seriously considered moving, right? Either going home or going to the United States to work. And so Canada, because of these restrictions, because nothing seems to work here, because people's freedoms seem to be always at risk, are thinking about other options. Like, can they leave? Can they go to other places? And that would be a big loss for those of us who love Canada and who want to stay here and have family here and don't think we'll ever want to leave.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I left, and so I am a fan of leaving. I was very concerned about what would happen to me if I stayed in Canada, and still am concerned, to be frank. Um, I know earlier you said that you don't recommend that people defy these bans on going into the forests in Nova Scotia and New Brunswick, but you know, the Freedom Convoy worked at the time. So people rising up and pushing back against this government overreach in terms of the COVID lockdowns and the vaccine mandates, it was successful because it ended the mandates and it ended the lockdowns. What do you, I mean, I'm asking you what you would recommend that people do in terms of pushing back, not just against this particular ban on hiking, fishing, using the crown lands, the forests, and I guess the private lands as well. Yeah, what would you say to people who want to challenge this?
What I would say is, you know, I'm a lawyer and I have a duty as a lawyer to tell people to follow the law. So that's something I always have to say. It is what it is. I mean, if you want to break the law to prove a point about how the law is unreasonable or unconstitutional, it's called civil disobedience, right? Like that's what people have done throughout history, from, you know, Mahatma Gandhi breaking India's salt tax laws to African-American people sitting at lunch counters where it was segregated and those seats were supposedly only for white customers. Like if your cause is righteous and you break the law to try and get that law changed, that's civil disobedience. And what you've done is technically illegal. The court might go easy on you, but they might not, right? So that's something you always have to be prepared for. And if you do break a statute like this statute, and it turns out that the court finds the statute was unconstitutional or the order was unreasonable to begin with, then that wasn't law in the first place. It wasn't real law, right? So there is a possibility through legal challenges that you might succeed in arguing that the Constitution protected you here and that law wasn't properly made or properly enforced. But I think for most people, the best way to fight this is to talk to friends about it, talk to your family, try and reason with them, sign the petition on our website, theccf.ca, where we're asking the Premier to rescind this travel ban, and, you know, donate to the charities that are fighting this. There are civil liberties charities in Canada, including the CCF, that do this work and that try and push back. Yeah, I think that's basically all you can do.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. It was really great to meet you. I'm so glad that we had the chance to talk, and thank you so much for your work. I appreciate it.
Thanks for your work too, Megan. Appreciate it.
Okay. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.